a very good afternoon and a warm welcome to today's webinar, From Urban Bonds to Continental Ties, a very timely topic. My name is Therese Magnusson and I'm the director of the Institute. And for those of you who may not be very familiar with the Institute, let me just say a few words. We are a research-led institute which was established by all the Nordic countries more than 60 years ago. Together with African and Nordic partners, we perform high-quality research in social sciences, aiming to explain the underlying societal dynamics on the African continent. Our combined knowledge informs policies among Nordic decision makers, and it is this co-creation of knowledge together with stakeholders and partners, which is at the very core of what we do, similar to what we're doing here today through this webinar. If we zoom in on the topic to be discussed, urbanization is, as we know, one of the most profound transformations that the African continent will undergo in the 21st century. Africa's cities are the most rapidly growing cities in the world. They are the youngest and they are changing fast. Their impact on Africa's economic, social, and political landscape in the coming decades is likely to be profound. Today's webinar aims to bring to the fore the importance of placing cities and subnational governments at the core of the implementation of continental integration initiatives in Africa by advancing the need for a city-to-city cooperation, in this case between Lagos and Johannesburg. The geostrategic importance of Lagos and Johannesburg cannot be understated. If both were countries, they would be in top 10 economies of Africa. And many of the key players in advancing development in Africa are based in these cities. The strategic documents by the cities of Lagos and Johannesburg already highlight why and how they can help in advancing continental integration objectives, such as the AU Agenda 2063 and the African Continental Free Trade Area. The starting point of the conversation will be that the continental integration agenda in Africa needs to be broadened in order to include subnational entities such as cities and civil society on the continent. Before we begin, let me first of all thank all our prominent and very experienced speakers and panelists for engaging with us today. I truly look forward to the knowledge exchange and the discussions that will follow. Let me now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Patience Mususa, Senior Researcher here at the Nordic Africa Institute, who will both provide an overview of today's program, but also introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. Patience, over to you.
Thank you, Therese. It's a pleasure to moderate this discussion that Therese has contextualized, and to welcome a really fantastic team of expertise. And first to introduce my colleague, Babatunde Fagbayibo, who is both a NI Africa scholar and also professor of international law at the University of Pretoria, on whom this webinar is organized around his project on cities as a site for deepening continental integration. And it's fantastic in a panel such as this to have both experts from the cities of Lagos and Johannesburg, but also academics coming both from bringing in Africa continental perspectives, but also from beyond in Latin America, bringing in the Mercosur experience. And so I'm very pleased to have on our panel from Johannesburg, we have Jan Erasmus, who is the Director of Strategy and International Relations and at the office of the city manager in the city of Johannesburg. We also have from Lagos, Yemisi Akimbade, who's head of trade and sister cities for Lagos State Office of Sustainable Development Goals and Investment. So yeah, very welcome and wonderful to have that on the ground expertise here. And from the University of Johannesburg, we have Friz Njanje, who's a professor of international relations in the Department of Politics and International Relations. It's great to have you here. And Cairo Gabriel Borges Junqueira, who is professor at the Federal University of Sergipe in Brazil. Who brings in both academic expertise on para diplomacy. And just to give a little bit of a kind of entry point into this, I was quite excited about it because as an urban scholar, oftentimes we're looking at the internal dynamics of cities, the challenges around infrastructure, but within the kind of broader context of deepening regional integration, it's also quite fascinating that there's also activities happening from the ground, cultural ties between Lagos and Johannesburg, and investment ties. We're very well familiar with both, both Lagos and Johannesburg's big film industries and a lot of kind of cross-pollination. But the kind of political, economic connections between the cities and what it takes to build a kind of regional integration is what I'm hoping will open up and deepen the discussion. So to start with you, Jan, to turn to the city of Johannesburg.
Thank you very much, Patience. Thank you. I don't know whether you can perhaps just fly the presentation, or do you just wanted me to do an overall introduction?
If you can start with a brief introduction about the work you do within the city and also the city of Johannesburg to contextualize the discussion.
Perfect. No problem. So you can fly the presentation, and then in the meantime, I'll do the overview of what I'm doing. I'm Jan Erasmus. I'm the Director, Strategy and International Relations. About 15 years ago, we've decided that we need to bring strategy closer to international relations. I've been involved in the development of long-term strategies for a 40-year time frame for the city of Johannesburg, because at that stage, we've said in 2006, we need about 3 decades of change for the big things that we need to do and for change to be effective. But also that strategy should be reflected in our dialogues and diplomacy internationally as well. So we've integrated the 2 offices of strategy and international relations. The international relations office is fairly small. We only have about 4 people. And on the strategy side, we're also about 5 people. So what we need to do is when we do particular strategy and research projects, we rather contract in specialists. You cannot always have specialists available on a full-time basis. We're also responsible for customer satisfaction surveys, which we do every second year to basically test the responses of the stakeholders in terms of political commitments and to see whether it's far apart, how close it is, etc. as well. And that's a longitudinal survey that's been going on probably for the past 16 years or so. So basically, just to come back to an introduction overview of Johannesburg, the next slide, please. I'm just going to provide you with a location of where Johannesburg is. So on the left-hand side, you see a picture of Africa with South Africa in the far southern corner of Africa. Within South Africa, there are 9 provinces. The smallest one is the province of Gauteng. You will see that dark corner, the dark spot in the middle map. And South Africa is the 9th largest country in Africa, but Gauteng is the smallest but the most populated province in Africa. And Gauteng is also the economic hub of the country, and it produces approximately 15% of the country's GDP. Next slide, please. And our population is approximately 6.09 million. So of the population, what's important is that we've got a youth population of approximately 37% of the total of 6 million. And that youth is sort of in the age categories between 15 and 34. And so our projection for 2040 is that the population will grow to approximately 9 million. But in the Gauteng province, there are 3 metropolitan areas. It's the city of Johannesburg, the city of Ekurhuleni, and the city of Tshwane. And together, the 3 metropolitan areas account for approximately 18 million people. And it's like a seamless development between the 3 metropolitan areas. And from a racial grouping, we've got approximately 80% Black African people, 9% white people, 5% colored people, and 5% Asian people. And also important is about 9% of population is basically migrants, international migrants in the country. Next slide, please. So just some basic information on access to services. Firstly, the formal dwellings in the city of Johannesburg accounts for 81%. The remainder informal, and informal are basically those that where it's not formal township establishment, where services are not necessarily fully established, etc. Access to water accounts for 99%, and South Africa is a water scarce country, so this is quite an achievement to have 99% access. Electricity is 78%, and we recently had a number of problems with energy and the supply side of energy, and the rollout of solar energy contributed a lot to the supply side, basically alleviating the pressure on the major energy supplier of South Africa, Eskom. Access to sanitation stands at 95%, refuse removal at 86%. In terms of the economy, the national GDP contribution accounts for 14.6%. The GDP growth rate stands at 2.8%, but a major challenge is obviously the unemployment rate of 33.5%, which is even more severe in terms of youth unemployment, which currently stands at 46.55%. And the poverty rate stands at 50%. From a social perspective, the Human Development Index is 0.7. The quality of life and the customer satisfaction is very in close proximity. It's 62% and 61%. And as I've mentioned, we do the customer satisfaction survey every second year, and we alternate it with a quality of life survey, which is being done for the Gauteng province as a whole. And then lastly, just in terms of inequality, the Gini coefficient stands at 0.6%, 0.6. Next slide, please. Okay, just some of the challenges and some of the opportunities on the challenges side, and this is probably very similar to what you'll find in Lagos and other cities in Africa as well. Firstly, rapid urbanization, high levels of unemployment, especially among the youth, service delivery, aging infrastructure, poor maintenance and backlogs, climate change, and we see the impact of climate change in virtually many cities across the globe at the moment. Spatial transformation is quite a big challenge still in Johannesburg, although we've made quite a lot of inroads into spatial integration, but there are still a number of challenges remaining. Inequality, the digital divide, and then lastly, the issue of governance and the revenues of local government that's under pressure. And it's probably important to note that the bulk of the revenue in a city like Johannesburg is generated locally with very minimal contributions from national and provincial government. Also under governance, a key issue is the issue of trust. And I think in all the surveys, it appears that constituencies don't trust politicians, they don't trust the administration, And even if it's somebody else saying the same thing, they will trust them more than somebody internal in an organization such as the city. Key opportunities, we're a cosmopolitan city. We embrace diversity, the economic hub of South Africa. In terms of service delivery, we've got high household access to services. We're advancing sustainables and a just transition. We've got an inclusive urban form supportive of the business environment, SMEs, and township economy. And public participation is quite rife in all the process in the city. It's a major challenge. But since COVID, we've seen that the opportunities presented by online participation and how many more people can actually access participation in the city through social media and through other online mechanisms as well. And just the last point then in terms of the priorities, and these are political mayoral priorities. It's good governance, financial sustainability, the energy mix, which is very important now to move away from dirty energy to clean energy, sustainable service delivery, infrastructure development, job opportunities and creation, safer city. Safety is a big problem in South Africa as well. Active and engaged citizenry, sustained economic growth, the green economy, and lastly, developing toward smart city practices. Thank you very much. And I will now move on just to, in terms of the state of international relations and how we approach international relations in the city of Johannesburg. As I mentioned, we moved away several years ago from ceremonial relations to strategic positioning and diplomacy. And in 2006, we basically started with the development of a new international relations strategy to ensure that we can be seen and that we can influence decision-making bodies where global debates take place and where we can also influence the agendas of these bodies. Because in many of these organizations, the Africa agenda is visibly absent, and it's dominated primarily by a European agenda and more of Asia-Pacific agenda as well. So it's important that there's an African agenda, and as I've mentioned, for instance, our youth issues, our unemployment issues, it's very different from other issues in other parts of the world. And therefore, we need to keep our agenda relevant in all of these. So as I also mentioned, that we then moved the strategy component into the international relations component and amalgamated it into one office to promote political priorities internationally and also then influence these debates, global debates based on our political priorities. The South African approach is that internationally, the South African cities do collaborate and do not compete. And I think that's a very important point because there are more and more cities operating in the global space. But when these cities operate there from a country perspective, there shouldn't be a competition amongst these cities. So we will not compete, for instance, with the city of Tshwane, the city of Cape Town, the city of Durban or eThekwini when it comes to global platforms. There we will collaborate on mutual and common issues of importance from a South African context. So the question is thus whether a city of Lagos, in terms of international relations and a city relation perspective, should focus on a city of Johannesburg or the city of Tshwane. Tshwane is our capital city. Cape Town is a coastal city. Johannesburg is the economic hub. So I think each city needs to decide what is it that they want to attract from a peer city and what are the benefits. So it's about mutual benefits that cities can attain from a city-to-city relationship and not purely a relationship that's signed and then nothing happens afterwards. In the city of Johannesburg, we do have a requirement that all strategic relations should be mutually beneficial and it should be active. So once a memorandum of understanding is signed, there's an action plan. The action plan spells out the areas of collaboration, who is responsible for that, what are the time frames, is there a budget attached to it, and there should be regular feedback on progress in terms of that as well. I then also want to come back to the lack of cohesion in Africa. I think the role of United Cities and Local Government Africa is very important in South Africa, but it is not really representative in the global networks of the views of Africa. And one of the key things is that we do not have an Africa strategy. I think, there's lots of talk about common areas, but what exactly is the strategy? What are your strategic choices? What are those things that you lobby for that you really think that will benefit the continent as a whole when you then negotiate with other continents as well? And I think one thing that's quite important, if you look at Latin America, and I think Cairo can probably give us more information about that as well, is organizations like Mercosidades and FLACMA is very active in the Latin America context. And they basically consolidate some of the major issues that's prevalent in the Latin America context. And those issues are then presented in a consolidated fashion at these global networks where debates basically take place. We also see that the Chinese friendship cities are becoming more and more active and also consolidating their strategic choices and putting it on the table. And a lot of the issues, you will never find common ground, but you can agree to disagree. And for instance, if you think about the gender issues, when you discuss that with many of the Middle Eastern countries, it's very sensitive. But unless you discuss it, you wouldn't understand what people think and how they respond to that. But through discussions, you actually understand where you differ and where you can agree to basically and work together on many type of things. I think it's also important to mention that subnational governments is basically never part of discussions when it comes to economic issues in major discussions of national platforms. And that is really a major problem as well. And therefore, you only come in at the end part of debates. Even in the United Nations, there's no room for local governments to sit. Local governments can either sit with business or they must sit with anybody else that's prepared to host them in a very special fashion. But I think through the United Cities and local government, there's a lot of pressure on the UN to open up the tables for discussions for local governments and to acknowledge that local government as a very important role player in global debates. Some challenge in terms of managing international relations in Johannesburg. I think firstly, it's the capacity of the office. I mentioned our office is very small. If you compare that, for instance, to a city like Sao Paulo, where they've got approximately 50 people in the international relations office with desks focusing on different parts of the world, I think we're pulling a little bit and punching above our weight at the moment, and we should probably not take on anything more at the moment. So therefore, we've decided to focus on global networks. That's really where we get a lot of mileage out of our investments. Some of these networks are for free. Some of these networks, you pay a membership fee, which is not really excessive. But where you can position your politicians to basically influence the agendas of these networks. The problem in Johannesburg over the past few, probably say the last 2 years to 3 years, we had a succession of mayors with the introduction of coalition governance as well, a period of instability. And some of these titles are specific to the holder and not to the city. So where it's specific to the holder, you basically lose your position and you need to start to lobby and pave the way again for somebody new to come into that space. So political change, we need to live with it, but we also need to be very agile in the way that we respond to that and reposition immediately once there's political change. Lastly, I want to address some of the opportunities. I think the best way for any city to start with a relationship with another city is through collaboration in a particular global network. And I've also asked the question, where is Lagos involved in? I've been informed that it's in C40, the Commonwealth, Resilient Cities, and I can't remember the fourth one. So some of the big ones for like UCLG, Metropolis, which is basically the key one for metropolitan cities to discuss metropolitan issues, with very different from the debates taking place in UCLG, where the focus is more on secondary cities. And these secondary cities are also large, but it's more on the metropolitan debates where Johannesburg is interested to engage in as well. One also needs to establish a contact point in a city, and it's normally through these global networks that you understand who are the contact points in a city, both at the political level as well as at the administrative level. And the glue is actually at the administrative level, because the political levels come and go continuously. But at the administrative level, there's stability, and you can actually ensure continuity in all relationships. Also, once the context is established, you basically then start with the incremental process. It's basically like any other relationship. You first court before you get married. So you don't just jump in at the deep end. So you build the relationship, and you basically then start to figure out what are the areas, the mutual areas of interest where each one can benefit. And the next step is normally then a knowledge exchange where cities get to know one another, they get to know the role players. And from that point onwards, you start with the formalization of the relationship as well. And then just one very last point on the issues of sustainability development goals. A lot of that is also reported on by national governments without even consulting local governments. And where the action is actually taking place is at the local government level. So in Johannesburg, we've also recently done our first local voluntary review. It was a very good exercise as well. And I think that's something where cities can learn a lot from one another as well. And also because the deadline of 2030 will probably be extended, because we don't think that we will be able to achieve all the targets by 2030. So that's quite an important exercise in the longer term as well. So I thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope there was some points at least of interest for you, and I look forward to the inputs of all the other participants as well. Thank you very much, and back to you, Patience.
Thank you, Jan. And this kind of provides a really nice stepping stone into the Lagos experience with Yemisi Akimbande, who's the head of trade for Sister Cities. And after that, we will shift to to Babatunde Fagbayibo, who will give the kind of contextualizing, connecting bit within the practical aspects of city networking, and to then the academic policy debates connected to that. So Yemisi, on to you, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patience. Could you please share the slides, please, Anna? Yes, Lagos State is Africa's fastest growing global city and one of the largest economies in West Africa. It is, however, the economic hub of Nigeria. Next slide, please. So I work with the Office of Sustainable Development Goals and Investment, head of the Sister Cities and Trade Department. Next slide, please. We work with to seek to achieve 3 major objectives, which is identify the office's priorities for accelerating SDGs progress in this decade of action. We create opportunities to partner with the office on strategic initiatives on the SDG Goal 17, which is partnership for the goals. And so by doing that is also by collaborating with other cities to meet those goals towards the 2013. And then the final objective is to align on the next steps once engagements, collaborations, and partnerships have been established. Next slide, please. So The Lagos State government made a strategic move in 2023 by carving out the office investment promotion arm for the office and was targeted to focus solely on SDGs. Now, our office used to be known as the Office of SDGs and Investments, but now solely investments. From being the primary investment promotion agency, attracting development-focused investments, facilitating ease of doing business in Lagos State, and overseeing SDGs, to just focusing primarily on championing SDGs implementations in Lagos State, positioning the state to achieve significant progress in the decade of action. Thank you. Next slide, please. Now, the City-Cities Department serves as the primary entity responsible for managing relationships between sister cities, twin towns, fostering international cooperation, understanding, and friendship between cities around the world. Our core functions includes facilitating communication and collaboration, cultural exchange programs, economic development initiatives, educational and academic partnerships. We coordinate humanitarian and social initiatives such as disaster relief efforts, public health campaigns, and social welfare programs. Tourism promotions, event planning and coordinations, protocol and diplomatic relations, as well as fundraising and grant writing and applications. Next slide, please. Now, the following cities are cities that we are collaborating with. We are actually on the MOU stage with, and these cities are Athens, Greece, and the areas of collaboration includes economic and commercial cooperations, cultural and tourism cooperation, environmental protection and resilience programs, Guangzhou in the Republic of China, on information technology, telecommunications, youth development programs, and educational cooperations. Selangor in Malaysia for medical and agricultural engagement programs, Brampton in Canada, information technology cooperation, and Port Novo in the Republic of Benin. Currently, we have plans with them to engage on sister city programs for agricultural exchanges and also trading in that aspect. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Yemisi. And this, I think, kind of provides a really nice stepping stone into my colleague Babatunde's work on cities as a site for deepening continental integration. Over to you, Babatunde.
Thank you, Patience, and thanks to Yan and Yemisi for painting that picture, which actually makes my job a bit easier, and I would be spending less time than I had anticipated on this conversation. So I think it's important for me to first start with kind of painting the picture around what stimulated this research. In May of 2017, there was a meeting which was not fully reported in the media. I think a couple of newspapers in Nigeria, and it was less reported in South Africa. A couple of newspapers in Nigeria actually reported it, and which I think was a very fundamental and important meeting in the context of subnational entities partnering between the governor, the then governor of Lagos State, Akinwumi Ambode, and the then premier of the Gauteng province, Premier Makura. And both actually met in Lagos and agreed that they would form some sort of region-to-region partnership. So, and again, we must understand that between this, within these regions are two important cities, in fact, that not only hold the economic, not only the economic nerve centers of both regions, but the economic nerve centers of their respective countries, their respective sub-regions and pillars of continental integration. And the plan was that by September of 2017, they will come back and sign an important MOU, which never happened. And of course, there were reasons why it did not happen because, many things, politics came into the picture. Many of them retreated back into national politics. And as Jan had already stated earlier, that city-to-city partnership or region-to-region partnership requires deep commitment beyond the politics. That is, when you put it in the hands of the administrators, for example, and you capacitate various centers, then you are able to sustain it. So politics came into the way and nothing happened. And there's been no serious talk around it happening. And that inspired me to say, look, these are two strategic cities on the African continent. In fact, not only are they cities within which, Pius Adesomi had used the phrase back in the day, they called them the sociology of superiority, in the sense that both cities understand how big they are, and it's in the music, it's in, many people sing about it. I come to Johannesburg to look for money, I come to Lagos to look for money, Lagos will change my life, and all of those things. And they also embody the contradictions. They are microcosms of many of the challenges we face on the continent. Both cities are they are what some urban scholars have called the paradox, the urban paradox, where affluence is matched by deep levels of inequalities. Johannesburg remains the most unequal city on the whole of the continent with 0.65 Gini coefficient. Lagos also is deeply, although Lagos State might have be one of the the most economic active in Nigeria, but also it also embodies levels of contradictions and levels of poverty. And both cities actually they're also similar in the context that they understand, they have see the way in which they can play at a global stage, feed into this global neoliberal structure, economic structure, and be able to advance many of their activities. But again, of course, they're also different in many ways. Johannesburg has more infrastructure than Lagos, and of course, Johannesburg is burdened not only by its historical but also by contemporary challenges. The deep apartheid, segregation and racial segregation and all of those things. The afterlives are still being experienced in the city. And of course, another advantage which Johannesburg has is that, in fact, Johannesburg is more of a microcosm of the African continent than any other city, arguably, on the African continent. You find many citizens of Africa coexisting within the city. You can literally walk from one street to the other and see citizens of about 10 African countries, in just 5 kilometers. And these are very, very important things. But again, have this been translated, of these opportunities, have they been translated into meaningful partnerships? Yes, both Lagos. So this research is based on the potentials and is aspirational, saying as it exists, as both Jan and Yemisi have shown, there's no partnership between both cities. Now, how do we imagine the possibilities of partnership within the context of development in continental integration in Africa? We are experiencing we're experiencing important developments in continental integration now. The Continental Free Trade Area has been adopted. The AU is rethinking many of its processes, trying to change the lethargic approach to many of the key things. But the reality is that cities and subnational governments have no seat at the table of regional integration in Africa. And this is something that did not start today. In fact, from the 1960s, African countries, be it unitary system of government or federal systems of government, have not been very comfortable with engaging or with allowing, bringing subnational government into the regional integration space. And yet, as we know, many of the challenges that we face or many of the issues that we are trying to achieve in terms of this continental integration, be it in terms of politics or in terms of economic integration, will be achieved in the cities. And to borrow a word that is often attributed to Mayor Bloomberg of New York, he says, nations talk, cities act. It is very, very important that we see the role of cities, the potentials of cities to work. Now, in terms of even comparing the paradiplomatic activities of both cities, Johannesburg actually has far more advanced and far more robust mechanisms for engaging in paradiplomacy. That is the ability, the powers of the cities. Paradiplomacy meaning speaking to how cities act as international actors, or how cities engage with others, be it other cities or with international organizations or with other national entities, and act as international actors on the global stage. Johannesburg, I mean, since it was the city of Johannesburg was established in the year 2000, has been engaged in series of activities, series of paradiplomacy activities. So it has city-to-city partnerships, as Jan had already indicated, with cities, be it in North America, cities in Asia, cities in the Middle East. For example, it has this partnership with the city of Ramallah in Palestine, cities in Brazil, and cities in China. So you have all of this, and so there's been this long years. And why? Why is that? Number one, many reasons, right? And that is why Fritz is going to be talking later now, and Fritz has actually argued in many of his works that we have to understand the domestic source of why cities want to act as actors. If you think of Johannesburg, you think of how it sees, number one, the sociology of superiority. Of course, it knows it's a big city, it's a city that has wealth and all of those, and a city that really wants to play. And of course, because of the South African legal systems, also allows for municipalities and the provinces, specifically municipalities, it gives them expansive powers to also operate as actors. And of course, post-1994 South Africa also allowed for this, flourishing of cities to also ride on the new wave of South Africa becoming part of the international system, and also the African Renaissance objectives of former President Thabo Mbeki, for example, making cities, seeing cities to see themselves as part of the African story, as venturing into other parts of the continent. So that's very important. And also in terms of the person, right? And again, I go back to what Fritz had written about in terms of, the golden years of the paradiplomacy of the city of Johannesburg, where you had Mayor Pat Stow, who was very, very, very active, had this very global worldview, seeing the role of Johannesburg acting as a very, very important player, which again, one cannot delink from the politics of the ANC as well. What some would call the progressive internationalism of the ANC, be it during apartheid or post-apartheid South Africa. So you see all of these factors, really, and of course, it has developed this robust mechanism. It has an IR strategy, for example. If you look at its current IR strategy, the 2016 IR strategy, speaking about how it sees itself, the lessons it has learned, of course, very introspective. These are the things, these are, many of our missteps in the years, and this is where we see the city of Johannesburg in the future, and how the city of Johannesburg would also be able to play on the international stage, and also identify Agenda 2063 as well, and the African Continental Free Trade Area as part of the continental frameworks of which the city of Johannesburg sees itself as playing or as being an important implementer. So those are very, very important. And of course, maybe before I jump to Lagos, because of its experiences as well, because of its years of experiences with paradiplomacy, the city of Johannesburg has also developed its own very original ways of looking at, engagements with other cities. And I think Ian had mentioned that in some of his works, building strategic MOUs, friendship MOUs, or project collaboration MOUs. And of course, also has been able to also assist other African cities, specifically the city of, for example, the city of Lilongwe in Malawi, to develop its own city development strategy. So these are, some of the issues that, one can actually glean from his paradiplomacy activities. to the city of Lagos, again, I think to say the city of Lagos is to also, it is true and not true at the same time, because the Nigerian constitution does not allow for metropolitan cities. There's no room in the constitution for it. So Lagos, again, what could be the city of Lagos is fragmented into 17 local governments, 37 LCDAs. And the plan, for example, in 2006, there was a presidential task team to look at how to create a Lagos megacity so that perhaps there could be some sort of a metropolitan city for Lagos. The 17 local governments coming together, and also 4 local governments from neighboring Ogun State. But of course, politics came in because the government at the national level and at the state level were in different political camps, and who funds this mega city and all of those things. So where we're at now is that the Lagos state government is actually in charge of paradiplomacy activities. And what in 2015, at least the first, there have been examples of paradiplomacy in Lagos for years, of course, being an important African city. But the first time that the Lagos state government would create an office to look at engaging in paradiplomacy, to look at engaging in international relations, was when in 2015 it created the overseas affairs, which is called Lagos Global, right, and investment, overseas affairs and investment in 2015. And it was through that the Lagos state government got in touch with the province of Gauteng in South Africa to start looking at ways to collaborate. And of course, that collaboration, as I said earlier, never happened. And of course, that office, after Akinwumi and Bode stepped down, did not win, could not scale through the primaries. And of course, the politics changed. Also, the office has now changed to the Office of SDGs and Investment. And as Yemisi had indicated earlier, the investment side of it has now been moved to the Ministry of Commerce in Lagos, but investment-related SDGs will now still falls under the purview of the office. And it's very, one would, I think it's also natural for Lagos to be very active in terms of, promoting SDGs. Lagos is a coastal city. It has witnessed, it has witnessed the brute force of the effects of climate change. And for scholars actually argue that if you want to see how Lagos State has been involved in paradiplomacy, one should look at climate change, issues of climate change, how Lagos State tries to assert itself as a player, even developing frameworks better than the national government on thing. And it is of little surprise that Lagos State is part of C40 and also part of other frameworks like that. But the problem is that because there is no metropolitan city, and because local governments in Nigeria, unlike municipalities in Johannesburg or in South Africa, local governments in Nigeria have little to no powers. In fact, for years there have been criticisms of how state governments actually manipulate and stifle the powers of local governments, where local governments are not able to fulfill their functions. So that again also affects, undercuts the ability to also bring cities into the picture. So if where the city-to-city platforms through which Lagos, or city networks or global networks in which Lagos participate, it's often the role of the Lagos state government. Even the sister cities as well, which Yemisi heads, is also under the purview of the Lagos state government. So those are some of the issues. And the question one would ask, and I've been asked this question since I started this research, is then, is it why Lagos, why Johannesburg, why not other cities, why this, why that, and all of those things? And for me, I think it is very important that, yes, even outside of the fact that these are the 2 most important cities, and as Therese had mentioned in our introduction, if these 2 cities were countries, they would actually be in the top 10 economies in Africa. outside of that fact, it is also very important that we begin to play with ideas, that we begin to understand how cities can be brought to the table. And it is very important that, yes, we can start experimenting with cross-border, and there are lots of cross-border corporations between local governments or municipalities. In South Africa, for example, I think Fritz would talk about that later. Or even in Nigeria, I know ECOWAS actually supports some cross-border municipality, local government corporation in West Africa, especially in the northern part of Nigeria, right? But again, the symbolism and the weight of having two of the biggest cities on the continent leading the charge in terms of cooperation would actually send a very clear message. And these two cities, again, with all the faults, with all their contradictions, actually have some sort of weight in terms of pushing for a kind of rethinking of the agenda of bringing cities. So, and now I move to the challenges. There are a couple of challenges because, if we are looking at, city-to-city network and saying Lagos and Johannesburg should cooperate, but we should also look at some of the obstacles to why that might actually impede their ability to cooperate. The first is that, number one, South Africa and Nigeria do not have a dynamic relation. There's no dynamic relationship. These are two countries that, to use the words of young people, they are frenemies, so to speak. They don't really have, some of the expected. These are two countries that should lead the charge, but they still struggle with many things. They don't even have a liberal visa regime between both. So I think some of the questions have been asked is that even if Johannesburg and Lagos wishes to cooperate, and they love this cooperation so much, so if Johannesburg invites people from Lagos, how are they going to get a visa, right? How quick will they get a visa to get to South Africa? So that is one. The second is that both the countries, both Nigeria and South Africa, do not include subnational governments and cities in continental regional integration process. Forget about continental. In fact, even at the sub-regional level, they are not included. The third is the growing levels of xenophobia that we experience in South Africa, and how this also detracts from the appetite for any serious cooperation between both countries. Back in the day, there was a mayor from 2016 to 2019 in Johannesburg who was widely accused of stoking the flames of xenophobia and blaming all the problems of the city on foreigners. Of course, you've also had politicians in the city who have also been engaged in some sort of rhetoric, anti-immigrant rhetoric. So that again is one of the problems. Another challenge is that the differences in the levels of development between, in terms of para-diplomacy activities between Lagos and Johannesburg is also another challenge because, at times it might be we are comparing apples and oranges in terms of the depth and the levels of the development. And another challenge is also the urbanization, the internal contradictions that I've mentioned, because for cities to also scale this, someone had asked while I was doing the field research to say, shouldn't cities be more concerned about taking care of their people than trying to play the big men or the big people on the global stage? That the primary responsibilities of cities is to first take care of their citizens and to deal with issues of inequalities and issues of poverty in their cities rather than scaling. So those challenges, the urban paradoxes that I had mentioned earlier, is also a very, very, very big one, because many of the energies that should be devoted to, for example, maybe para-diplomacy would rather be devoted to local politics in some cases. And lastly, there's no continental framework for cities to be involved in regional integration in Africa. In fact, the only framework which is already law at the African Union level, but is yet to be implemented by any of the member states, is the African Charter on Local Governance that became law in 2019, that actually enjoins the African Union Commission to establish a platform through which cities could cooperate and influence the regional integration process. That has not been implemented thus far. In fact, there's another law, the African Union border cooperation, a charter on cooperation, a border cooperation, cross-border cooperation. Again, that has not been signed by the requisite number of member states for it to become law. So we're dealing with challenges of even laws, the frameworks at the continental level are not there. So what are the opportunities? I will spend very few minutes in ending this. How do we scale this? If Lagos and Johannesburg were to envisage any form of partnership to kind of look at how to cooperate, I think, of course, it goes without saying that there needs to be a serious knowledge and understanding of continental integration processes. In fact, when one compares, so both Lagos and Johannesburg actually have two city development frameworks. So the IR strategy of 2016 in Johannesburg and the Lagos State Development Plan from 2021 to 2052. Both, in fact, the similarities is that both actually understand that there's continental integration process. Both understand that they can key into the Continental Free Trade Area. In fact, the Continental Free Trade Area is mentioned in both of these documents, interestingly. But again, in terms of how to key into it, there's very little analysis of how to key into it. And the reason is that you can't blame city officials. The problem is that they're not included in the process. As Jan already mentioned, they are not part of it. So how, for example, are you part of what, would you be able to kind of, provide more information on something you are, national governments have not made serious efforts to say, okay, you do this, you do that, and, these are some of the areas and frameworks, but nothing prevents cities from thinking outside of this. The other point, one key point is that if this cooperation is really going to work, will come to fruition, there has to be what I call the centralized, decentralized, or decentralized, centralized system. What do I mean by this? In terms of broadening the participation, the participatory dynamics of, or the participatory kind of ecosystem in terms of the relations. We all know that politicians are very, very good at the pictures and the glitz and the glamour and making big pronouncements. We are going to have this, we are going to have that. But it's also important that if you broaden this process and bring civil society, bring young people, bring women, bring actors, local actors, then it's very important that you do that. Oh, I see that I already have 1 minute now. Let me find that. And also emphasis on strategic, comparative and competitive advantages. What do you bring to the table? Both of these cities have different things they bring to the table. I've always looked at issues of culture, for example, how you could incorporate cultural actors in both cities into propagating the importance or the gospel of cooperation. And lastly, investment in evidence-based practices and ideas. This is where you bring in the academia. Both cities actually boast of some of the big universities on the continent. They boast of serious research institutes, and all of those things. How do you begin to locate your relations and your relationship within the context of evidence-based, sustainable evidence-based? Thank you very much. Sorry for going beyond my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Babatunde. You've spoken to Frizz's work, and Frizz, you've worked on several work on kind of para-diplomacy and the role of African agency and politics within these global city networks. So I will turn to you in terms of the political motivations driving these efforts to broaden connections.
Okay, thank you so much, Patience, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by thanking Babatunde for putting the spotlight on what I consider to be a very important issue, but which is nonetheless neglected, both in terms of policy discourses and academic work. As Babatunde has indicated, I am currently involved in similar research looking at how subnational entities that are located on South Africa's international borders, how they do engage with their counterparts on the other side of the border and what this means for regional integration. So that brings my work squarely to the all-important issue that Babatunde has identified in his research. And I think, Babatunde, you've done a good job in trying to make a good case for why cities and other subnational governments should be brought closer to the regional integration processes on the continent, not only because the issues and the challenges that underpin the regionalization efforts on the continent, they actually, cities and other subnational governments are at the confluence of these issues. But I also do believe that they've got the potential to actually root this regional integration and region building efforts in the experience of the people and not leave it at the level of intergovernmentalism as we've seen over the past years. And I like the fact that you've identified in your paper some of these challenges and the broader context within which, if Johannesburg and Lagos were to partner as drivers of African integration, some of the issues that will need to be taken into consideration, in particular, the precarious material base that all of the three speakers before me have identified, which will remain a major constraint for any future partnership between Johannesburg and Lagos. Importantly, the element of the absence of institutional space at the national level, but also at the regional level. As Babatunde, you've clearly elucidated that there is little space for subnational governments to actually contribute not only to bilateral diplomatic engagement, but to broader regional integration efforts on the continent. But also importantly, they will have to contend with the fluidity of urban politics and the fact that international relations at this level, similar to what sometimes obtains at the national level, is highly personalized, which undermines the element of institutionalization that is needed to carry on these partnerships when individuals leave office. But to add to this, Babatunde, from where I sit, is the recognition that if we look at the internationalization of cities on the continent and their potential contribution to regional integration, we have to take into account how the Pan-Africanist impulses that informed and inspired earlier iterations of integration on the continent has gradually receded in favor of a more intergovernmental and market-driven approach to regional integration. And also we've seen the deprioritization of social integration. So the social dimension of integration is no longer there, or one will say it was there in the beginning when we look at frameworks like the Lagos Plan of Action, which talked about bringing Africa together as a key strategy to transform the plight of the continent. But we see over the years, this social dimension to integration has been lost. And that has implications for what kind of role that cities can play in driving the integration agenda. And I do agree with you with regard to the principles that you've identified and what you call the nodes of engagement, bringing in businesses, focusing on academic and cultural exchanges. But I also do believe that if cities were to play a meaningful role in driving African integration, at the heart of such an endeavor will have to be the Pan-Africanist ideals of solidarity and human emancipation, because we can't look at regional integration in Africa similar to perhaps how we look at integration in Europe, in Asia, or in Latin America, because the drivers of integration in Africa are informed by different impulses that we need to take seriously if we are to advocate for a more deepened integration where cities and other subnational governments play an increasing role, which means that in terms of the areas of focus for potential collaboration between Lagos and Johannesburg, it would be good to also look at how such a partnership could drive the element of contributing to the local integration of migrants, because that is a burning issue that we have, particularly in the context of South Africa and Johannesburg. You made reference to the challenge of xenophobia that will continue to underpin whatever efforts that could be done in that regard. And I think such a partnership between Lagos and Johannesburg can become a mechanism through which cities can then play a more concrete role at the social level to deal with some of the challenges that will undermine broader regional integration. I want to spend the last few minutes of my intervention to speak to two broader issues that I think are critical if we talk about the role of cities and subnational governments broadly in the integration agenda on the continent. And these issues speak, Babatunde, to the conceptual underpinnings of your study. And the first has to do with how you understand regional integration in this context. I see in your paper, you make reference to neo-functionalism, which suggests that you recognize a broader understanding of integration away from the preeminence or the exclusive influence of nation states, but to bring in other actors who could contribute in deepening regional integration. And with this is what I've already pointed out, is that recognition that regional integration in Africa has a long history, and that we need to go back to that history to understand what are supposed to be the key objectives of integration. It's not about just to facilitate trade, or it's not about allowing governments a platform to discuss in what Frederick Sederboom has referred to as some kind of a regime boosting regionalism, which does not filter down to address the challenges that the people face, but rather serve in boosting the interest of the governments of the day. So I think if we have to talk about Lagos and Johannesburg playing a critical role, we need to first have a clear understanding of what we mean by regional integration in this context. Otherwise, we'll be inviting the cities or the subnational government to simply reinforce a kind of integration that has failed the African people over the decades. But I think an alternative will be, and here drawing from the research that I'm doing on cross-border paradiplomacy and its implication for regional integration, an alternative is to conceptualize regionalism on the continent as some kind of a bottom-up process that may complement the efforts of national governments, but also will not shy to come up with independent initiatives to bring some kind of an alternative approach to regionalism that is rooted in the lived experiences and the aspirations of the ordinary African, and not necessarily look at it through the prism of how nation states will want to see African integration. And here I will give you the example of what I found out on South Africa's border with Mozambique and Eswatini. They've got this initiative they call the Umsebe Partnership, which brings together 4 cities and municipalities, 2 on the South African side, 1 from Mozambique and the other from Eswatini, to work together to deal with their common challenges. And the interesting part of this is that they do not wait to be given space by the national government. And if you see, South Africa has got a number of regional integration schemes that cut across these countries. But none of these are coordinated with these subnational initiatives. So they run parallel, but they decided this is an initiative where the mayors in these 4 cities decided to come together, to work together instead of relying on their national government, instead of looking to further away cities to draw experience or support, that they could pull together and deal with their common challenges. I think that is a model that could be worked on how African cities and other subnational governments could play a meaningful role in driving the integration agenda without necessarily waiting for them to be given space in other regional integration schemes like your SADC or the AU. Babatunde, you've correctly alluded that the AU has, for all intents and purposes, not taken the lead in recognizing the kind of role that cities and subnational governments could play in deepening African integration. So I think we need to start thinking beyond relying or knocking the door to actually create an alternative path that sees integration differently and primarily from the vantage point of how it will contribute to assisting the African people. And this brings me to the second point, which has to do with your focus on anchoring your study in the literature on paradiplomacy. I was wondering that in addition to the literature of paradiplomacy, you may not find it useful to look into the related literature on city diplomacies and even veer a little bit towards urban studies to look at the literature on global cities, which could provide some insight in trying to understand what drives contemporary cities, both globally and on the continent, and which may bring in a different element on how we can understand the kind of role that the international cooperation of cities such as Johannesburg and Lagos could play in furthering African integration. So if you read the works of scholars such as Saskia Sassen, who've argued, I know even in my research that you made reference to, I have made a case that we need to take the domestic sources of city diplomacy seriously, but we can't also overlook the fact that the cities today that we are talking about, they are to a large extent creatures of the neoliberal capitalist system, and that imputes in them the kind of identity that may at some point be contradictory to the kind of role that we require or we expect them to play, particularly on the African context. So when we talk or when we see, say, Johannesburg, we see Lagos as drivers or catalysts of regional integration in Africa. We also need to bear in mind that these are aspiring global cities, and that as they try to further the African agenda, this may collide with their interest to position themselves favorably, competitively in the context of the global cities phenomenon. And this means that there may be this tension between, on the one hand, ensuring that they play a key role in rooting the African integration agenda in the experiences of the people, while at the same time making themselves relevant and competitive globally. I take the case of Johannesburg. It's trying to serve as a world-class African city, but we can ask the question, to what extent can we see that Africanness in the way the city is run and the way, even in terms of the kind of partnerships that it forges? One can argue that to some extent it is that aspiration to be a world-class city that takes precedence over the African identity of the city. And this then could have implications for whether it is in the position to be able to drive the African integration agenda. So are we going to see cities that realize that the regional integration agenda on the continent will require them to actually take seriously the aspirations of the African people, the struggles of the African people, the need to promote solidarity among the African people? Or are we going to see an integration which rather creates space for big businesses to actually flourish, or a kind of integration that allows Lagos, allows Johannesburg to be further integrated into the global economic centers? So I think those are some of the issues that we'll need to reflect critically upon as we make the kind of suggestions that you make, which I think are very crucial if we have to take seriously African integration. I would like to end there.
Thank you, Fritz. And that provides a really good entry point actually into Cairo's work, which focuses very much on the Mercosur experience and the role, and I know he's written quite a bit on the role of municipal activism and other dynamics. So Cairo, over to you. And we'll wrap up. We won't have that much time for questions at the end, but what we'll do is that we'll collate the questions and respond as quickly as possible. Thanks, Cairo.
Thank you. My presentation will take, I think, 10 minutes long, so I will be very quick. So good afternoon for everyone. Thanks so much, Paciente Mususa, for the introduction. I'd also like to thank Babatunde and the North Africa Institute for the invitation. And for me, it's a pleasure to be here debating the project and trying to put some insights about city-to-city cooperation and of course, power diplomacy. I've already read some papers of Professor Fritz that spoke right now. So I am an adjunct professor at the Federal University of Sergipe here in Brazil, and I'm researching the connection between subnational governments and regional integration for more than a decade. And it's excellent to see these results concerning Africa, of course, more broadly, and Nigeria and South Africa. So when I've talked with Babatunde, he said that I should make some appointments about the agenda of this webinar. And here we are talking about subnational internationalization in South America. My research background here in South America is about the South Common Market, the Mercosur. And Mercosur was created in 1991 by Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. In theory, Mercosur is a common market, but in practice, it's a customs union. And I think that comparing South American and African experience of regionalism and regional integration is a good idea to foster the debate and to look beyond the European process. And why I'm talking about this? Because I said Mercosur is a customs union. It's intergovernmental. So Mercosur always has some crisis problems, if I can say that. But Mercosur is the main regional organization here in the Southern Cone. So doing some comparisons between both experience, and when I talk both, I'm talking about, for example, African Union and Mercosur. It's very good for the debate. So in less than, I think I have 7 or 8 minutes right now. I will try to highlight some aspects of Babatunde's project that are correlated with South American power diplomacy and Mercosur. And here I will focus on 6 topics that are the main topics of my presentation. So my first topic concerns the importance to develop and compare city-to-city cooperation in Africa and South America. And this statement may seem a little obvious, but it should be said because looking at the experience of the North and notably Europe is important, and we should and should be taken into account. However, this doesn't mean that what happens there should be taken as a basis for regional integration and power diplomacy in other regions of the global South. Ian, for example, mentioned some challenges and opportunities of Johannesburg. And many of them are familiar to me here in Brazil, for example. And compare our realities is very good for the debate, because power diplomacy can also deal with common public problems that we see in South America and Africa. The second topic already exemplifies this. For example, in Africa and South America, we see what we call overlapping regionalism. Overlapping regionalism here and there is crystal clear. So we have the African Union, but we also have 8 regional economic communities. And here in Latin America, we have, for example, Mercosur, Pacific Alliance, Andean Community, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, Union of South American Nations, and so on. So this aspect is fundamental to think about not the proliferation, but the deepening of regional projects. And this is so important when we talk about the creation of subnational spaces and forums inside regional blocks, as Babatunde mentioned before. The third topic here, other question, is the intergovernmental aspect that Babatunde mentioned, that in Africa exists little attention paid to subnational entities. This quote is inside Babatunde's project. So in here, I'm not saying that those processes, including Mercosur, including the African Union, should be what we call supranational. But we have to think about how we can include cities, for example, not in decision-making process itself, but at least in influence decisions. If subnational governments cannot decide politically in the regional realm, that they can at least be a locus of influence. I think that we can think about it. The fourth topic it starts with a question. How can it be done inside, for example, African Union or Mercosur? National and central governments must see that power diplomacy is related with actors and not merely an agenda. So the fourth topic is what Babatunde called, and here I quote again, the existence of subnational platforms in the regional process. Here is a main difference between Africa and South America. Here in South America, in Mercosur, we have subnational representation through 2 institutions. The first one is the Mercosur Cities Network that Ian already mentioned, Mercocities. And another institution is the Mercosur Advisory Forum of municipalities, states, provinces, and departments. But it's not the same thing if we compare, for example, with the Committee of the Regions of the European Union. Mercocities is an autonomous organization and it's not inside Mercosur structure. Mercocities exists, but is not inside the organizational chart of Mercosur. Mercosur was created by municipal and not central interests. And nowadays, Mercocities comprise, if I'm not wrong, more than 350 members nowadays. What has happened and is happening here in Mercosur is this. The organization that has been most successful has been the one created by the city's own autonomous interests, Mercocities, and not the one formally created in Mercosur, the FCCR, sorry. So here I just like to finish this fourth topic with a question. Considering Mercosur experience, I will question this. In Africa, and obviously concerning the African Union, in Africa, we need institutionalized subnational forums, in other words, inside the blocks, or autonomous subnational forums, in other words, organizations created only by the interest of cities, states, and so on trade experience and best practices. I think this is a fundamental aspect to think about African power diplomacy. And I don't know if we will have time for Q&A, but I also like to say that I don't know the answer of this of this question, but I think it's nice to think about it. The fifth topic concerns the institutionalization of power diplomacy in the subnational public administration itself. Here, I'm not talking about institutionalization inside blocks. I'm talking about institutionalization inside the public administration itself. Babatunde and another one just mentioned that Johannesburg has like an IR department, and in Lagos, this is a competence of the state government. And exists an asymmetry in the degree of institutionalization of power diplomacy in Johannesburg and in Lagos. If it's not, how can I say, if it's not mandatory, at least this is a fundamental aspect for thinking about power diplomacy. In other words, subnational governments, they tend to strengthen internationalization as soon as there is a formal structure in their administration for this, in terms, for example, of funds or even human capital. For example, here in South America, cities like São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro here in Brazil, Buenos Aires in Argentina, or even Montevideo in Uruguay, all those cities have secretariats or departments of international relations, and our examples should be taken into account. Just to finish, my final topic concerns the three nodes that Babatunde mentioned. So private companies, and Babatunde mentioned the business sector, universities, and cultural stakeholders can support power diplomacy, and I agree with that. But I'd like to finish my presentation saying that one aspect is primordial to power diplomacy anywhere, not here, only here in South America, or in my opinion, in Africa. What is this aspect? Is the political will. For me, the mayor, the governor, or other leadership must see subnational internationalization as a fact today that can increase subnational capabilities and deal with public policies. And many times, power diplomacy is not an end activity, but it's a means. It's a means, and some mayors or some governors just have to think about it. It's linked with the topic of institutionalization in terms of local policies or even regional policies in terms of regional integration. And so I try to be very, very quick, and that's it. I will finish my presentation here. Thank you so much again. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I hope these and other projects are going to be very, very fruitful. And back to you, Pachi. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, all of you. And it's been a really fruitful discussion. We've heard about, you know, the background and political motivations to city cooperation, the impotence for regional integration, the challenges that the cities of Lagos and Johannesburg face, both in deepening ties, but also dealing with municipal administration and regional administration, but also the lessons from beyond, you know, looking to experiences and lessons from South America. And this is an excellent example. Thank you, Babatunde, Yemisi, Cairo, Friz, and Jan, and to my colleagues at the Nordic Africa Institute, Anna Mutis and Johanna, for the logistical support for this. And I would say that your research, Babatunde, is an excellent example that brings practice, the perspectives of practitioners, research, but also research thinking very much within a policy lens, but also an aspirational lens, thinking about Africa's urban futures, but also Africa's wider relations with both each other and with the world. We would like to thank our participants who have posed questions. I think there's some of them we have taken note of them, and if you need to follow up, do get in touch with a colleague, Babatunde Fagbayibo, and he will be happy to respond and follow up with some of those discussions. So thank you and have a good afternoon.